A storm, a millionaire, and a worn-out violin, the unexpected encounter that will forever change Eleanor's life, revealing her as the heroine of a story of resilience, love, and secrets no one saw coming. On the damp, gray streets of the English countryside, Eleanor moved with careful steps, clutching little Henry tightly against her chest. The icy pavement felt even crueler that morning, but it was a common scene in their lives. Her violin, old and worn, was the only link to the hope she still dared to carry. Playing trembling notes into the wind, she tried to collect just enough to ensure her brother wouldn't go to sleep hungry. It wasn't easy, but she had promised herself that Henry would never feel the weight of despair. Henry's large, watchful eyes followed her every move. Despite the biting cold and his empty stomach, Henry smiled like someone unaware of life's cruel twists and turns. Eleanor treasured that smile. It was the only thing that kept her moving forward. The money tossed into her violin case rarely covered more than a stale loaf of bread and a cup of tea. Still, she refused to beg. The lies she'd have to tell to convince someone of her desperation would fill her with shame. The nights were always the worst. In a cheap boarding house, they shared a thin mattress that barely softened the ache of their tired bodies. Henry, with his childlike innocence, fell asleep quickly, while Eleanor lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling. Whispers from the past visited her, reminding her of a life that no longer existed. She pictured herself as a child again, smiling with a violin in hand at school recitals, when dreams still seemed possible. Now, the future felt like an endless road, always paved with new challenges. The storm that night was the climax of cruelty. The gusts of wind were so violent that newspapers flew like aimless birds. Eleanor, holding her brother close, tried to shield him beneath a rusted awning. The sound of the violin strapped to her back tinkled faintly, almost like a lament. "It'll be okay, Henry," she whispered, though her fingers were nearly frozen. Deep down, she feared the cold was merely a metaphor for the life they led. Then, the headlights of a car appeared in the darkness. A luxurious car, far too clean for that decaying scene. Eleanor lifted her face, her heart pounding. The door of the vehicle opened, and a tall man, wrapped in an expensive overcoat, walked toward them. Jonathan Blake. His gaze was serious, calculating, yet there was something different. A flicker of compassion that surprised even him. "You need help," he said, his firm voice cutting through the wind like a blade. Eleanor instinctively stepped back. She wasn't foolish. Life had already shown her that acts of kindness often hid ulterior motives. "We're fine, thank you," she replied, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. Jonathan didn't look convinced. He glanced at Henry, huddled in his sister's arms, with eyes that seemed to analyze every detail. Something about that scene struck him, perhaps a memory or a quiet discomfort. The storm howled around them, as if the night itself were about to collapse. The millionaire insisted, his words direct, almost pragmatic. "You won't survive out here. Come with me." Eleanor looked at her brother, at the empty streets, and at the man who seemed to come from another world. Hesitation consumed her. Trusting him would mean letting down her guard. Jonathan noticed and added, without waiting, "It's not charity. Just a roof for the night." Even in the darkness, Eleanor noticed that his eyes, though cold, were sincere. It was a dilemma she couldn't ignore. Henry, always perceptive, tugged at his sister's sleeve. "Please, Eleanor. It's so cold." That simple sentence was enough to make her relent. Eleanor took a deep breath and followed Jonathan to the car. The warmth inside the vehicle was almost shocking, as though they'd crossed into another world. Henry smiled for the first time that night, his face illuminated by the soft dashboard lights. Eleanor, however, kept her eyes fixed on the window, watching the frozen world slip further away. The mansion appeared minutes later, like a sleeping giant wrapped in mist. Eleanor couldn't believe what she was seeing. The opulence of the building, the ancient stained glass windows, the spiral staircases. "Welcome," Jonathan murmured, pushing open the massive wooden doors. Henry, wide-eyed with wonder, ran inside as if he'd stepped into a fairy tale. Eleanor entered more slowly, her steps hesitant. The mansion seemed to whisper promises of safety, but she knew promises weren't always kept. As Jonathan watched the two of them, almost expressionless, Eleanor couldn't help but think, what does this man want in return? What could a millionaire, used to bargaining with money and power, possibly gain by sheltering two strangers? The storm still roared outside, but inside, there was warmth, light, and a solid floor beneath her feet. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt that perhaps fate was giving them a pause. Just a pause. Jonathan watched Eleanor and Henry as though they were a puzzle waiting to be solved. Seated near the massive fireplace, wrapped in soft blankets, the contrast between the poverty they came from and the luxury of the mansion was almost cruel. Eleanor couldn't relax. Her body remained tense, her eyes sharp, as if waiting for this comfort to be snatched away at any moment. Henry, however, was already smiling again, enchanted by the warmth and the light filling the room. For him, it was a miracle; for Eleanor, a test of her patience. Just one night, she whispered to herself, stealing a glance at the millionaire studying them in silence. Jonathan didn't look like a man who acted on impulse, which made it all the more puzzling. His cold, pragmatic gaze suggested that he never did anything without a reason. Perhaps it was just pity, or worse, charity, and Eleanor loathed the idea of being seen as someone who depended on another's generosity. Life had taught her that accepting favors always came with a price, one she'd paid far too many times. "You must be hungry," Jonathan finally broke the silence, his deep voice echoing off the tall walls. Soon after, dinner was served on a table so large that Eleanor and Henry looked minuscule in comparison. Henry devoured every bite, his face glowing with joy. Eleanor, however, barely touched her food, her gaze fixed on her plate, her mind lost in thought. "Why are you doing this?" she blurted suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, surprised by her directness. "Because no one deserves to face a storm alone," he replied simply. There was sincerity in that sentence, but Eleanor couldn't bring herself to believe it. Jonathan Blake didn't seem like the type to hand out kindness for free. He was a millionaire, someone who dealt in money and contracts, not desperate people and their messy lives. Eleanor looked at Henry, who was laughing over something simple, like a spoon slipping from his fingers. In that moment, she realized that, perhaps, this offer had been a gift in disguise. Even so, her inner resistance refused to fade. When Jonathan suggested they pick a room for the night, Eleanor felt the weight of fear pressing on her chest. What did this truly mean? Her feet hesitated on the polished marble stairs, as if crossing that threshold would place her in dangerous territory. "We shouldn't be here, Henry," she whispered, but the boy, already sleepy, only smiled. "I like it here, Eleanor. He's nice." That innocence, always so bright, tugged at her heart. He trusted without reservation, while she had long been broken by the lies of the world. Jonathan, meanwhile, watched from afar, as though handling a wild animal ready to bolt. He couldn't understand why something so simple seemed so difficult for Eleanor. Offering shelter didn't feel like a great effort, not for a man who had so much. And yet, something about this woman, the sharpness of her gaze, the rigid posture, the worn violin strapped to her back, made him realize she was used to fighting, not receiving. Perhaps, he thought, this was the only way to survive for someone who'd never had anything. That night, while Henry slept deeply for the first time in a long time, Eleanor sat by the window, her heart restless. Outside, the storm still howled, but the mansion was a refuge she couldn't ignore. Her fingers brushed against the violin case, as though it were her only shield. "We're leaving tomorrow," she whispered, though something deep within her knew that leaving would be harder than she imagined. The warmth of this place wrapped around her like an embrace she didn't know she needed. Jonathan, on the other hand, couldn't sleep. He stared at the high ceiling of his room, feeling an unease he didn't recognize. Accustomed to controlling everything around him, business, money, people, he didn't know how to handle this situation. Why did two fragile strangers trouble him so much? The image of Eleanor shielding Henry from the wind refused to leave his mind. Perhaps he saw himself in that scene, lost in some fragment of a past he avoided remembering. At dawn, Eleanor awoke to the distant sound of birds and realized she had slept dreamlessly for the first time in years. Henry was still curled under the blankets, his breathing slow and peaceful, as though he never wanted to leave. Sunlight filtered through the window, casting a golden glow on the wooden floor. For a moment, Eleanor felt something she didn't dare admit: relief. But that sensation came with a silent warning: nothing good ever lasted. They had to leave before everything fell apart. When she descended the stairs, she found Jonathan waiting, impeccably dressed as always. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice calm. Eleanor nodded but kept her expression guarded. "Thank you for the shelter, but we'll be leaving now." Jonathan frowned, confused. "You don't need to go anywhere." Eleanor's voice was firm as she responded, "We don't belong here." Jonathan fell silent, but there was something in his gaze that seemed to say, "This isn't over." Eleanor had made up her mind to leave. She carefully picked up the violin, cradling it as though she were protecting a part of her soul. Henry, his hair still tousled from sleep, looked at his sister in confusion. "Why do we have to go?" "It's warm here," he whispered, his eyes pleading for an answer she didn't want to give. Eleanor took a deep breath, pulling him gently by the hand. "Because we don't belong here, Henry. Things like this, they don't last." The promise she made to herself echoed again. Never trust, never rely on anyone. Jonathan stood by the door. It was as if he had expected this moment all along. His face remained calm, but his eyes carried something unspoken, a mix of disappointment and resignation. "You're leaving," he said flatly, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Eleanor met his gaze, holding her ground. "We never should have stayed. Thank you for the help, but we don't need anything else." Her voice was steady, but Jonathan could hear what lingered underneath: fear and pride, forged through years of hardship. Before Jonathan could respond, the sharp sound of heels echoed down the marble staircase. "Jonathan? You're letting them leave already?" Isabel's voice, dripping with sweetness and venom, cut through the air like a knife. Eleanor froze in place as Isabel appeared, perfectly dressed and smiling that practiced, condescending smile. Her eyes scanned Eleanor like she was inspecting an insect. "People like them don't belong here, anyway," she added with false innocence. Eleanor felt her hands tighten around Henry's. She bit back the urge to reply. It wasn't worth it. Jonathan turned toward Isabel, irritation flashing briefly across his face. "Isabel, that's enough." But the damage had already been done. Eleanor's heart pounded, her chest tightening as if a fist had closed around it. The words weren't new, she'd heard them before, in whispers and accusations that followed her like shadows. Without another word, she gripped Henry's hand tighter. "Let's go," she murmured softly, her voice shaking in the effort to stay strong. The door to the mansion opened with a low creak, and the wind from outside rushed in like a cruel reminder of what awaited them. Henry hesitated, pulling back slightly. "Please." "We don't have to leave," he said, his voice breaking. She knelt down to face him, brushing his hair gently. "We'll be fine, Henry." "We always are," she whispered, even as her own voice trembled with doubt. Jonathan watched the exchange, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He wanted to say something, to stop them, but the words never came. Eleanor stepped outside, Henry in tow, as the door closed slowly behind them. The mansion, with its warmth and safety, was already receding into the distance. The cold air hit her like a slap, but she welcomed it. It was a familiar enemy, one she knew how to fight. "You don't have to do this," Jonathan's voice echoed faintly in her mind, but she shook it off. Eleanor had learned long ago that no kindness came without a cost. Better to leave now than to owe something she could never repay. As they walked down the misty road, Henry glanced back at the towering mansion, his expression full of longing. "He didn't want us to go, Eleanor." "I know he didn't." His words struck a nerve, but Eleanor kept walking, her gaze fixed forward. "Sometimes it doesn't matter what people want, Henry," she replied softly. "We can't stay where we don't belong." The words tasted bitter, but she told herself it was the truth. The wind howled through the trees, as if mocking her stubborn pride. Back in the mansion, Jonathan stood by the window, watching their figures disappear into the fog. Isabel's voice broke the silence, laced with triumph. "See? They don't belong here, Jonathan. You're better off." He turned to face her, his expression sharp and cold. "That's enough, Isabel." His words left no room for argument, and for once, Isabel fell silent, though a smug smile lingered on her lips. Jonathan turned back to the window, his chest heavy with something he couldn't name. Why didn't I stop her? Eleanor and Henry eventually found shelter under the twisted branches of an old oak tree. She wrapped her coat around Henry as he shivered. "Why can't we ever stay somewhere nice, Eleanor?" he whispered, his voice small and tired. Eleanor pressed a kiss to his forehead, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Because nothing good comes for free," she replied. The truth was harsh, but she needed him to understand. Life hadn't taught her to expect kindness without consequence, and she wasn't about to start believing in it now. As night fell, the road stretched endlessly ahead of them. Henry eventually fell asleep, leaning against Eleanor, while she stared into the distance. The mansion, Jonathan, Isabel, it all played in her mind like a cruel reminder of what she could never have. Why did it hurt so much to walk away? She wondered, though she refused to admit it aloud. Somewhere deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, leaving had been a mistake. That night seemed endless. Eleanor and Henry had found meager shelter beneath an old stone bridge, where the wind howled a little less fiercely but the cold remained merciless. Henry huddled against her, shivering despite the thin blanket she wrapped around him. "I'm sorry, Henry," she whispered, her voice almost lost to the wind. The boy looked up at her, his expression soft and sincere. "I'm not mad, Eleanor." His small smile carried an innocence that only children possess, an innocence that made her ache inside. "You're too nice, Henry," she murmured, brushing a lock of hair from his face. Henry tilted his head, thoughtful. "He wanted to help us. Why didn't you let him?" Eleanor stiffened, her fingers tightening on the blanket. "Because not everything is what it seems, Henry. Sometimes people only help when they want something back." Her voice was firm, but Henry's eyes, wide and questioning, wouldn't let the subject go. "But what if he really meant it? What if we just missed our chance?" His words echoed inside her, digging at doubts she refused to voice. Those thoughts plagued Eleanor through the long hours of the night. She didn't sleep. Instead, she stared out into the misty darkness, her mind replaying the scene at Jonathan's mansion. She remembered the warmth of the fire, the safety of the walls, Henry's carefree smile. What if Henry was right? What if she had let pride rob them of something good? No, she told herself firmly. The world wasn't that kind. But still, Henry's words persisted. What if we missed our chance? When dawn broke, gray and unwelcoming, Henry stirred beside her, yawning sleepily. "Did you hear that?" he asked, sitting up with a smile. "What?" Eleanor replied, her voice rough from the cold. Henry stretched his arms toward the pale sky. "It's morning. That means it's going to be okay." Eleanor blinked at him, bewildered. How could he see hope in something so small? How did he always manage to find light when everything else felt so dark? He had a gift, one she couldn't understand, or maybe had just forgotten how to use. As if sensing her hesitation, Henry reached for the violin case, carefully pulling it open. "Play something, Eleanor. Please?" His voice was soft, but there was so much trust in it that Eleanor couldn't refuse. She lifted the violin to her shoulder, the strings cold against her fingertips. For a moment, she hesitated. What was the point? But then she began to play, and the music drifted into the still air like a whispered promise. Henry smiled, closing his eyes as if the notes could shield them both from the world's harshness. "You always play when you're sad," Henry murmured after a while, his voice sleepy but content. Eleanor stopped mid-note, staring at him. "I play because it's the only thing that still feels like mine," she said quietly. Henry smiled again, this time wider. "And that's why you're so good at it. It's like magic, Eleanor. You just don't see it." Those words, so innocent, lingered in the air long after Henry drifted back to sleep. Magic. Eleanor didn't believe in such things, but Henry, he believed in everything. The weight of her decisions pressed against her chest. Eleanor looked at the boy sleeping peacefully beside her and realized something. He wasn't just her brother. He was her strength, her reason for fighting. Henry had a way of seeing the world not for what it was, but for what it could be. His hope was stubborn and pure, and somehow, it always pushed her to keep going. Maybe, just maybe, he was right this time too. Maybe walking away from the mansion had been a mistake. Eleanor? Henry's sleepy voice broke through her thoughts later that morning as they packed up their meager belongings. Can we go back? She froze, staring down at him. Go back where? She asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. To the big house. Jonathan didn't want us to leave. I know he didn't. Henry's words were so filled with conviction that Eleanor felt her walls begin to crack. It's not that simple, she muttered, but Henry held her hand, his grip warm despite the cold. Maybe it is. The idea hung between them as they started walking again, but Eleanor couldn't shake it. Henry believed in things she couldn't allow herself to. Trust, kindness, second chances, none of those belonged in her world. And yet, Henry was her anchor. His belief was unshakable, and somehow, it always managed to steer her in the right direction. You really think we should go back? She asked softly, surprising herself. Henry beamed, as though her words had already sealed their fate. Yes. I promise it'll be okay. Eleanor sighed, feeling the walls she'd built begin to crumble. Fine, she murmured at last, ruffling Henry's hair. We'll go back. But just until the storm is gone. Henry hugged her tightly, his joy infectious, and for the first time in days, Eleanor felt a tiny spark of hope. As they began their walk back toward the mansion, the silhouette of the house started to emerge through the mist. It loomed large and unfamiliar, but this time, Eleanor didn't see it as a trap. What if Henry's right? She wondered. What if this really is a second chance? The Blake mansion looked even larger in the light of day. Its tall windows reflected the overcast sky, and the silence that surrounded it felt imposing, like a king watching from a throne. Eleanor stood at the entrance, her grip on Henry's hand firm, as if holding him could keep her grounded. Jonathan waited by the door, calm as ever, though his expression softened when he saw them. You came back, he said, his voice measured. Eleanor hesitated, her pride wrestling with her choice. Just until the storm ends, she murmured, as if trying to convince herself. Henry didn't share her reservations. He rushed inside, his small feet pattering across the polished floors as he marveled at the house once more. It's even bigger in the daytime, Eleanor, he exclaimed, his laughter filling the air like a melody. Eleanor followed cautiously, her steps deliberate, her eyes scanning every corner of the grand entry hall. Everything here was pristine, the kind of life that people like her never got close to. And yet, here they were, standing in its very heart. Jonathan watched her closely, his hands in his pockets. You're safe here, Eleanor, he said, his voice calm and certain. She turned to face him, the defiance still flickering in her eyes. I don't believe in safe, she replied, though her voice was quieter than before. Jonathan nodded slightly, as if accepting her answer for now. Then let's just call it shelter, he said, before turning and disappearing into one of the many hallways. Eleanor's shoulders relaxed just a little, though she still felt like a stranger in a place she didn't belong. The mansion slowly revealed its secrets to Henry, who explored it as though it were a castle straight from a fairy tale. Eleanor followed him, more out of concern than curiosity, but she couldn't deny how beautiful it was. The vast halls, the paintings that stared down at them with their watchful eyes, the library that seemed to hold an entire universe within its shelves, it was overwhelming. Henry's face lit up at every new discovery. Look, Eleanor. There's a room full of books. I bet they have stories about knights and dragons. Eleanor smiled faintly, though her heart still resisted. We won't be here long enough to read them, she replied, brushing a hand over one of the spines. The books smelled of dust and time, of lives she would never know. Henry, however, didn't seem to care. Maybe just one story, he said with a grin, running his fingers along the shelves. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, watching them with quiet amusement. You're welcome to stay as long as you like, he said, his voice startling Eleanor. She turned, her guard rising again. We won't take advantage of you. That's not what I meant, Jonathan replied, the faintest hint of warmth in his tone. Eleanor didn't answer, but something in her shifted. It was strange, this man who seemed so untouchable, offering them kindness with no visible strings attached. She didn't trust it, couldn't trust it, but for now she didn't fight it either. Henry looked at Jonathan with wide, curious eyes. "Do you have dragons in this house?" he asked seriously, earning a quiet chuckle from the man. "No dragons, but maybe a few secrets?" That night, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The bed in the guest room was far too soft, too clean, and it felt foreign beneath her. Henry, on the other hand, slept soundly, his small form cocooned in blankets as though he belonged there. Eleanor sat by the window, staring out at the vast gardens that stretched into the mist. "This isn't real," she told herself. "It's temporary." Yet the warmth of the room, the distant hum of a house that felt lived in again, chipped away at her certainty. Jonathan, too, was awake, wandering the halls of the mansion. He stopped at the library, the faint echo of Henry's laughter still lingering in his mind. It had been years since this house had seen joy, real joy. He thought of Eleanor, of her sharp gaze and unshakable walls, and wondered what had made her so guarded. People like her didn't just appear out of nowhere. They carried stories, and Jonathan wanted to understand hers. He knew better than to push. People like Eleanor required time. In the days that followed, the mansion began to change. Henry's energy filled its empty spaces, and even Eleanor, despite her efforts to remain distant, began to settle into a routine. She cooked simple meals in the massive kitchen, cleaned up after Henry's adventures, and even explored parts of the house when no one was looking. One afternoon, Henry discovered an old piano in a sunlit corner of the library. "Eleanor, look, do you think it still works?" She touched the keys hesitantly, a soft, familiar sound filling the room. For a moment, the memory of her childhood returned, and her fingers lingered. Jonathan found her there later, standing over the piano as though it held a secret. "Do you play?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head quickly. "Not anymore." Jonathan tilted his head, his voice calm but curious. "Why not?" Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, she picked up the violin case that never left her side and walked away. Jonathan watched her go, realizing that Eleanor was far more than she appeared to be. And as much as she resisted, she was slowly becoming part of the house, and part of something he couldn't yet name. The mansion had taken on a new rhythm, as though Eleanor and Henry's presence had awakened something long dormant. Henry, with his boundless energy and curious nature, quickly became the heart of the house. He ran through the halls, explored the gardens, and filled every corner with laughter. "This house is magic," he exclaimed one afternoon, spinning in circles on the library rug. Eleanor watched him with a mixture of fondness and unease. It felt good to see him happy, too good, and good things in Eleanor's world never lasted. Jonathan observed it all from a distance, quietly. Eleanor had become something of an enigma to him. She was cautious, wary, her walls built so high that even kindness struggled to break through. Yet her actions told a different story. She cooked small, modest meals, cared for Henry with a love that spoke louder than words, and carried her violin everywhere, as if it were a lifeline. Jonathan admired her strength, but it frustrated him too. Why won't she trust anyone? He wondered. It was Isabel who shattered the calm. She arrived unannounced one afternoon, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, her presence like an icy wind sweeping through the house. "Jonathan, darling," she called, her voice sweet but sharp. Eleanor, who had been tidying up near the entrance, froze as Isabel's gaze fell on her. The smile on Isabel's face didn't reach her eyes. "And who is this?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Jonathan appeared just then, his jaw tightening as he took in the scene. "Isabel, what are you doing here?" "I could ask the same," Isabel replied smoothly, her eyes flicking back to Eleanor. "I didn't know you'd taken in guests." The word hung in the air like an insult. Eleanor clenched her fists but said nothing, her face carefully blank. She'd met people like Isabel before, people who knew exactly how to cut others down with a single glance. "They're none of your concern," Jonathan replied firmly, though Isabel's smirk told Eleanor she wasn't finished yet. That was how people like her worked, planting seeds of doubt and walking away, waiting for them to grow. Over the next few days, Isabel lingered like a shadow. She made casual remarks about Eleanor's clothes, her silence, her violin. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said to Jonathan one evening as Eleanor passed by with Henry. You don't know anything about her, yet you've let her into your house. People like her? Well, they always want something, don't they? Eleanor heard every word, though she pretended not to. Her pride stung, and doubt began to creep in. What am I even doing here? She wondered. Jonathan noticed the change in Eleanor. She spoke less, avoided him more, and her steps, once cautious but steady, now carried a hint of retreat. One evening, as she sat silently by the fire, he approached. Isabel said something, didn't she? He asked. Eleanor looked up sharply. It doesn't matter what she said, she replied, her voice cold. Jonathan didn't press, but frustration flickered in his eyes. You're letting her win, he said softly, though Eleanor pretended not to hear him. Henry was her only ally in those moments of doubt. I like it here, Eleanor, he said, tugging at her sleeve one morning. Jonathan likes us too. I know he does. Eleanor sighed, brushing a strand of hair from his face. Henry, people like us don't get to stay in places like this. It's not how the world works. But Henry's response was simple, cutting through her defenses like only he could. Maybe it's time the world worked differently. His faith was unshakable, and it gnawed at Eleanor's fears. The tension came to a head one evening. Jonathan had asked Eleanor to play the violin again, and reluctantly, she agreed. The music floated through the mansion, gentle but haunting, carrying all the unspoken stories Eleanor refused to share. When the last note faded, Isabel clapped slowly from the doorway. Impressive, she said, her smile sharp. It's almost like you've been practicing for this moment your whole life. Eleanor's face burned, and she stood quickly, grabbing Henry's hand. We're leaving, she said, her voice shaking. We don't belong here. Jonathan followed them to the door, confusion and frustration warring in his expression. What are you doing? He asked, his voice low but urgent. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes hard. Your friend is right, Jonathan. I shouldn't be here. I don't know why I thought this could work. Henry clung to her, his face crumpled with confusion. But Eleanor, enough, Henry, she interrupted, though her voice nearly cracked. She opened the door, the cold night air rushing in. Thank you for everything, Jonathan. But we'll be fine. Jonathan watched as they disappeared into the darkness, the door closing heavily behind them. He turned to face Isabel, his expression unreadable. You wanted this, didn't you? He said quietly. Isabel shrugged, feigning innocence. I simply pointed out the truth. Jonathan didn't respond, but the weight of her words, and his silence, hung over him like a shadow. Somewhere deep down, he knew he'd made a mistake. The wind was unforgiving as Eleanor and Henry walked through the empty streets, the darkness pressing down like a weight. Henry shivered under the thin coat Eleanor had wrapped around him. Where are we going, Eleanor? He whispered, his voice small and uncertain. Eleanor glanced down at him, her own heart heavy. Somewhere warm, she said softly, though she didn't know where that would be. The truth was, leaving the mansion had felt like the right choice at the time, but now, it felt like a mistake she couldn't undo. They eventually found shelter in an abandoned church, its broken windows and creaking pews offering little warmth. Eleanor sat against the wall, her violin case clutched tightly to her chest. Henry curled up beside her, his head resting on her lap. It was nice there, Eleanor, he said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Eleanor looked down at him, brushing his hair gently. I know, Henry. Her voice cracked just slightly. But it wasn't ours. Places like that, they don't belong to people like us. Henry frowned, his small face scrunching up with thought. Jonathan liked us, though. I know he did. Eleanor's chest tightened. Henry's innocence and hope were as unshakable as ever, but she couldn't share his faith. Liking us doesn't mean we belong, she murmured. People like Jonathan, they don't keep people like us around. Henry didn't argue. Instead, he nestled closer, drifting off to sleep while Eleanor stared at the shadows on the ceiling, her mind replaying Isabel's cruel words and Jonathan's silence. Meanwhile, Jonathan stood alone in the empty library, the weight of Eleanor's departure pressing down on him. He sat in the chair where Henry had once excitedly flipped through books, the absence of that joy now echoing loudly. Isabel had disappeared shortly after, smug and satisfied, but Jonathan felt no victory in her departure. Instead, he felt an ache he couldn't quite define. "You're letting her win," he'd told Eleanor, but now he realized he'd let himself lose. Eleanor had left because of his silence, his hesitation, and that realization gnawed at him. Unable to shake the thought of her, Jonathan made a decision. He spent the next morning digging into Eleanor's past, trying to understand her story. His resources were vast, and within hours, he uncovered details that left him speechless. Her parents' sudden deaths. Her abandoned dreams of performing on grand stages. The years of struggle, of sacrifice, of holding her brother's life together when everything else had fallen apart. Each detail painted a clearer picture of the woman he'd so easily let walk away. Jonathan sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Eleanor wasn't an opportunist. She wasn't someone who'd come to take advantage of him. She was a survivor, someone who had fought against a world that seemed determined to crush her. And he had believed Isabel's lies, even if only for a moment. That guilt sat heavily on him, and with it came a new resolve. He couldn't let things end this way. "I have to find them," he murmured to himself, grabbing his coat and car keys. Eleanor, meanwhile, sat in the cold, empty church as daylight streamed weakly through the cracked windows. She pulled out the violin and began to play, the notes soft and mournful, as if the instrument itself shared her pain. Henry woke to the sound, his eyes sleepy but bright. "I love when you play, Eleanor," he whispered. "It sounds like you're telling a story." Eleanor paused for a moment, looking down at him. "Maybe I am," she said softly. A story of struggle, she thought, of loss and of carrying on. Her music drifted through the empty space, floating up to the rafters as if carried by invisible hands. It brought her a strange sort of comfort, a reminder that even when everything else was taken from her, this was hers. Henry watched her, smiling as if the music were enough to keep them warm. "Jonathan would love this," he said suddenly. Eleanor flinched, the bow stuttering on the strings. "Don't talk about him, Henry," she replied sharply, surprising even herself. "He's not part of our lives." But even as she said it, she knew the words were hollow. Jonathan had been part of their lives, even if for just a short while. He had offered safety, warmth, and something more, something Eleanor didn't want to name. The way he had looked at Henry, the way he'd watched her play, the small gestures of kindness she'd tried to ignore, they all lingered in her mind. Why did I leave? The question nagged at her, growing louder with each passing moment. At that very moment, Jonathan's car pulled up near the church. He had spent hours searching, retracing steps, and asking questions until he'd found someone who'd seen them heading toward the outskirts of town. He stepped out of the car, scanning the area, and spotted a faint light filtering through the broken stained glass. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt nervous. What if she refused to listen? What if he was too late? But he pushed those doubts aside and walked toward the church, determined to fix what he had let break. Inside, Eleanor had just finished her song when she heard footsteps. Her head snapped up, and her heart began to race. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and there he was, Jonathan Blake, silhouetted against the light. He looked different somehow, less like the untouchable millionaire and more like a man carrying his own weight of regrets. Eleanor stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "What are you doing here?" Jonathan met her gaze, steady and calm. "I came to find you, Eleanor." Eleanor's pulse quickened as Jonathan stepped into the abandoned church, his presence filling the empty space like a gust of wind. The sight of him there, in this forgotten place that had nothing to do with his world, unsettled her deeply. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice sharp but shaking slightly. Jonathan stood his ground, his hands in his coat pockets, and his gaze steady. "I needed to find you." Henry, who had been half asleep, sat up suddenly, a wide smile spreading across his face. "Jonathan!" he exclaimed, as though seeing an old friend. Eleanor shot Henry a warning glance before turning back to Jonathan. "What do you want?" she demanded, her tone defensive, though a part of her already knew the answer. Jonathan took a slow breath, measuring his words. "To make this right?" Eleanor let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "There's nothing to make right. We don't belong in your world. Jonathan. We never did. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but she forced them out, determined to keep the walls around her heart intact. Jonathan didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his expression softening in a way Eleanor had never seen before. You're wrong, he said quietly. You don't belong to anyone's world, Eleanor. You've built your own, and it's stronger than anything I've ever seen. Eleanor froze at his words, her chest tightening. How could he say that? How could someone like him understand the weight of every sacrifice, every rejection, every loss she'd endured? Don't pretend you know me, she shot back, her voice breaking slightly. I do know you, Jonathan replied, his voice firm but calm. I know what you've given up for Henry. I know how hard you've fought just to keep going. I know you're afraid to trust anyone because the world has given you every reason not to. But I also know this, you're not alone anymore. Eleanor stared at him, stunned into silence. Jonathan's words hit like a hammer, breaking through defenses she'd spent years fortifying. Henry watched quietly, his innocent gaze shifting between the two of them as though he could sense the importance of the moment. You don't understand, Jonathan, Eleanor whispered after a long pause, her voice barely audible. People like me, we don't get second chances. Life doesn't just give us things. Jonathan took another step closer, his tone unwavering. I'm not trying to give you anything, Eleanor. I'm trying to show you that you've earned it. You've earned safety. You've earned happiness. And you don't have to fight alone anymore. His words carried no pity, only truth, and truth was far harder for Eleanor to accept. Tears burned behind her eyes, but Eleanor blinked them away, shaking her head furiously. Why do you even care? Why do we matter to you? Jonathan paused, as though choosing his next words carefully. Because you reminded me of something I lost a long time ago. The will to care. The will to believe in something beyond myself. When I saw you in that storm, holding Henry, I saw someone who hadn't given up, someone who couldn't afford to. You woke me up, Eleanor. And I won't stand by and let you disappear again. Eleanor turned away, her breath uneven, her mind racing. How could she trust this? How could she trust him? Every instinct told her to keep running, to protect herself before the ground beneath her crumbled again. But then she looked at Henry, whose small face was lit with quiet hope. Eleanor, he's telling the truth, Henry whispered. I know he is. Eleanor's heart wavered. Henry had always been the one to see light in the darkest corners, and he had never been wrong. Jonathan took the final step, closing the distance between them. Eleanor, he said softly, don't walk away again. Let me help you. Let me help Henry. I know I can't erase what you've been through, but I can be part of what comes next, if you'll let me. Eleanor looked at him, her resolve fracturing like glass under pressure. She had spent so long carrying the weight alone, so long believing that relying on anyone would only lead to disappointment. And yet, here was Jonathan, offering not charity, but partnership. Offering a future. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant howling of the wind and Henry's steady breathing. Finally, Eleanor whispered, if we come back, I won't be a guest. I won't let you pity me. Jonathan's gaze softened, his lips curving into the faintest smile. You were never a guest, Eleanor. And I would never pity you. Henry clapped his hands together, his smile radiant as if a weight had been lifted off his small shoulders. We're going home, Eleanor, he cheered. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, though she quickly wiped them away. We'll see, she murmured, her voice still guarded but softer than before. Jonathan extended his hand, and for the first time, Eleanor didn't pull away. She hesitated, then reached out, her fingers brushing against his. It wasn't much, but it was enough, a bridge across a chasm she had long believed uncrossable. Jonathan's hand closed gently around hers, a silent promise shared between them. As they stepped out of the church, the morning sun was breaking through the clouds, casting soft beams of light across the frost-covered ground. Eleanor glanced at Henry, who grinned at her as though everything in the world had just been made right. Jonathan walked beside them, quiet but steadfast, as though this journey back was as important to him as it was to them. And for the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to wonder, what if this isn't the end of the fight? What if this is just the beginning of something better? The drive back to the mansion was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the air. Eleanor sat in the back seat with Henry, her fingers resting on the violin case as though it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Henry, however, was brimming with excitement, his wide eyes taking in everything outside the window. "We're really going back, Eleanor," he whispered as though afraid saying it too loudly might break the spell. Eleanor only nodded, her expression guarded, though her heart beat in rhythms she didn't recognize. When they arrived, the mansion no longer loomed like a shadow. In the light of day, it felt different. The doors opened, and Jonathan stood waiting, hands in his coat pockets, his expression calm but welcoming. "Welcome back," he said simply. Henry bolted out of the car, his laughter echoing as he ran toward the house, disappearing into its vastness. Eleanor stepped out more slowly, her gaze sweeping across the grand facade, searching for something, an excuse, a warning, anything that would let her pull away. But nothing came. Inside, the warmth hit her immediately. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, the scent of tea and fresh bread lingering faintly in the air. Henry's laughter carried down the halls as he explored, but Eleanor stood frozen at the doorway. Jonathan watched her, his gaze steady. "It's yours too, Eleanor," he said quietly as though reading her thoughts. She turned sharply to face him. "We're not charity cases, Jonathan," she snapped, the old reflex of pride surfacing. Jonathan didn't flinch. "I know you're not." Eleanor hesitated, her shoulders sinking just a little. "Why do you care so much?" she whispered, the words raw and full of doubt. Jonathan held her gaze, his voice calm. "Because you matter, Eleanor. Both of you do. I don't know how else to say it." There was no pity in his tone, no sense of obligation. It was the first time anyone had said such words to her without expecting something in return. Eleanor's throat tightened, and she turned away, unable to face the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Later that afternoon, Henry found her in the sunlit library, her violin balanced in her lap. "You're going to play, right?" he asked, his voice bright with anticipation. Eleanor looked at him, then at the instrument, her fingers tracing its edges. "I don't know, Henry," she murmured. Henry tilted his head, thoughtful. "But you always play when we're happy. And we're happy now, aren't we?" Eleanor's heart cracked just a little at his words. Happy. Could it really be that simple? She hadn't felt safe enough to use that word in years. Jonathan entered quietly as Eleanor tuned the strings, his presence unnoticed until she began to play. The notes started soft, hesitant, like a question whispered into an empty room. But as her fingers moved, the music grew stronger, filling the library with a sound that felt alive. Jonathan sat in the corner, listening without a word. For the first time since they'd returned, Eleanor let herself exist in the moment. The music poured out of her, each note carrying pieces of her past, her pain, and, beneath it all, a fragile hope she could no longer deny. When she finished, the silence that followed was thick, almost sacred. Henry clapped, beaming. "You're the best, Eleanor," he shouted, his small voice breaking the spell. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, a faint smile touching her lips. Jonathan stood, his gaze warm but quiet. "You should play more often," he said, his voice low. Eleanor looked down, brushing her fingers over the strings. "Maybe I will," she replied softly, though the answer felt like a promise to herself more than to him. The days that followed were filled with small, unexpected moments of peace. Eleanor cooked again, simple meals that brought life to the massive kitchen. Henry spent his days exploring, inventing games and filling the house with sounds it hadn't heard in years. And Jonathan changed too. He no longer hid behind his work or his silence. He was there, present, helping Henry plant flowers in the garden, or sitting quietly as Eleanor played her violin in the afternoons. Slowly, the mansion became more than just a house. It began to feel like a home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor found Jonathan sitting by the fire, Henry asleep beside him. "You don't have to keep doing all of this, you know," she said, her voice hesitant but honest. Jonathan looked up, his expression serious but kind. "I'm not doing this because I have to, Eleanor. I'm doing this because I want to." She stared at him for a long moment, searching for any trace of insincerity. Finding none, she nodded faintly and sat across from him, the warmth of the fire dancing between them. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to exhale. She didn't know what the future held, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The mansion, Jonathan, Henry, it was more than she ever thought she deserved, and yet, here it was. As she looked at her sleeping brother, his small face peaceful in the firelight, Eleanor realized something profound. They had been given not just shelter, but a chance to dream again, to build something real. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could finally let herself believe it. The days began to blend together, but for Eleanor, each one felt like a small miracle. The mansion was no longer a prison of shadows or a symbol of everything she couldn't have. It had become something more, a place where she could breathe, where Henry could laugh, and where the future didn't feel quite so terrifying. Henry ran through the gardens in the mornings, planting seeds with Jonathan and watching them grow, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Look, Eleanor, we're growing flowers," he shouted one afternoon, his voice full of wonder. Eleanor watched him from the steps, a soft smile tugging at her lips. Jonathan was always nearby, though he gave her space. He didn't push, didn't pry. Instead, he was just there. Whether helping Henry tie a crooked bough on a sapling or sitting silently in the library while Eleanor played the violin, Jonathan's presence was steady. It felt foreign to Eleanor, this idea of someone staying without expecting something in return. One evening, as they sat by the fire after Henry had gone to bed, Jonathan finally broke the silence. "You don't have to fight anymore, Eleanor. You can let yourself rest?" Eleanor didn't answer, but something inside her softened at his words. Still, Eleanor wasn't someone who trusted easily. There were moments when her old fears crept back, whispers in her mind that this was too good to be true. One night, as the rain pattered softly against the windows, she stood in Henry's room, watching him sleep. "We can't stay here forever," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, his gaze steady but unreadable. "You're thinking about leaving again," he said quietly. Eleanor turned, startled but didn't deny it. "Places like this don't last," she said. Jonathan stepped into the room, stopping a few paces from her. "You said that before," he replied, his voice calm but insistent. "But you're wrong, Eleanor. This house isn't what makes this work. We do. You, Henry, me, we make it a home." Eleanor looked away, the words striking deeper than she wanted to admit. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything," she muttered. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Henry, peaceful in sleep, and then back at her. "I know what it's like to have everything and feel nothing," he said finally. "And I know that this, you too, means more to me than I ever thought possible." The honesty in his voice caught Eleanor off guard. For so long, she'd believed she had to carry everything alone. She was strong because she had no other choice. But here, in this house, with Jonathan and Henry, the weight had begun to lift. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Eleanor found herself in the library, her violin case resting beside her. Henry burst in, his face flushed from playing outside. "Jonathan says we can build a treehouse. Can we, Eleanor? Please?" His enthusiasm was contagious, and Eleanor let out a small laugh. "A treehouse?" she asked, glancing at Jonathan, who stood in the doorway. Jonathan shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "Henry has a lot of ideas." Eleanor rolled her eyes playfully but couldn't hide the warmth that crept into her expression. "Fine," she said, ruffling Henry's hair. "But only if you let me help." Henry cheered and bolted from the room to start planning his castle in the trees. Jonathan lingered behind, watching Eleanor as she ran her fingers over the violin strings absent-mindedly. "You're smiling more," he said softly. Eleanor glanced up, her smile fading slightly as she looked at him. "Don't read too much into it," she teased, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. Days turned into weeks, and the house began to transform. Jonathan and Henry built the treehouse with Eleanor's help, the three of them laughing and bickering like a family. The garden flourished under Henry's watchful eye, the flowers blooming where once there had been nothing but neglected soil. The mansion, once a silent, empty place, now pulsed with life. Eleanor would often stop and listen to the sounds: Henry's laughter, the creak of floorboards, the faint hum of Jonathan humming to himself as he worked. It was a kind of music she'd never known she needed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and violet, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the garden. Jonathan joined her, his hands in his pockets as he gazed at the scene before them. Henry was in the treehouse, waving a wooden sword and declaring victory over imaginary foes. "He's happy here," Jonathan said quietly. Eleanor nodded, her arms crossed as she watched her brother. "That's all I ever wanted for him." Jonathan turned to her then, his gaze soft but serious. "What about you, Eleanor? What do you want?" Eleanor hesitated, the question hanging between them. For years, she had wanted nothing more than survival, to keep moving forward, no matter how difficult. But now, with Jonathan standing beside her and Henry's laughter filling the air, something new tugged at her heart. "I don't know," she admitted softly. Maybe this?" Jonathan smiled faintly, his voice low. "Then let yourself have it." Eleanor looked at him, 1,000 words unsaid, but in that moment, it didn't matter. For the first time in years, the road ahead didn't feel so lonely. The Blake mansion stood as a silent witness to the transformation unfolding inside its walls. Once cold and empty, it now echoed with laughter, music, and life. Henry's treehouse had become his kingdom, where he led imaginary battles and built secret inventions from scraps of wood. Eleanor watched him one afternoon, leaning against the garden's old stone wall. A soft smile tugged at her lips. "He's happy," she thought, as the sound of his laughter carried on the breeze. It was more than she could have hoped for. But Eleanor's own transformation was slower, more fragile. The walls she'd built over years of struggle weren't easy to tear down. Some days, she still woke before dawn, gripped by old fears that whispered this new life couldn't last. She would sit in the quiet of her room, fingers tracing the worn edges of her violin case, as if it could remind her of who she was. One morning, Jonathan found her there, staring out the window at nothing in particular. "You don't have to keep running, Eleanor," he said softly, standing at the doorway. "Not anymore." Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What if it all disappears, Jonathan? What if it's just temporary?" Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. Jonathan stepped closer, his gaze steady and warm. "Then we'll figure it out together. But I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor. And neither are you, unless you choose to." The certainty in his voice unsettled her, not because she didn't believe him, but because a part of her desperately wanted to. Trusting was like walking a tightrope over open air. It wasn't until later that day that everything shifted. Henry had run ahead into the woods beyond the garden, chasing after a butterfly. By the time Eleanor realized he was gone, her heart was already pounding. "Henry," she called, running toward the tree line, panic rising like a storm. Jonathan followed close behind, his face sharp with concern. "He can't have gone far," he assured her, but Eleanor's fears were already spiraling. What if something happened? What if I lose him too? The thought clawed at her, undoing every fragile thread of peace she'd built. They found Henry perched on a low branch of a tree, grinning proudly. "Look, Eleanor. I climbed all by myself," he shouted. Eleanor stopped abruptly, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. "Henry, you can't just run off like that," she cried, her voice cracking. Henry blinked, startled by her tone. Jonathan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "He's fine, Eleanor," he said softly. But Eleanor wasn't listening. The fear, the old, familiar fear, was overwhelming. "You could have gotten hurt," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Henry scrambled down from the tree, his face falling as he ran to her. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he said quietly, tugging on her hand. "I didn't mean to scare you." Eleanor knelt, wrapping her arms around him tightly, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. "You're all I have, Henry," she whispered against his hair. You can't leave me." Jonathan watched from a few steps away, his heart aching at the scene. For Eleanor, fear had always been her shadow, but in that moment he saw just how much weight she carried on her own. As they returned to the mansion, Eleanor was quieter than usual, her emotions a storm beneath the surface. That night, as Henry slept soundly in his room, she found herself in the library, staring into the fire's glow. Jonathan joined her, sitting across from her in silence. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Eleanor," he said finally, his voice gentle. "You don't have to carry everything by yourself." Eleanor looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't know how," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've never known how." Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You're stronger than you realize, Eleanor. But strength doesn't mean being alone. It doesn't mean never needing anyone." His words settled over her like a balm, softening wounds she hadn't realized still bled. "You let Henry trust me," he added. "Why can't you trust me too?" Eleanor didn't respond right away, but she didn't look away either. Slowly, her defenses began to crumble, piece by piece. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fight alone anymore. The next day, Eleanor found Henry and Jonathan in the garden, planting new flowers. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice light, almost tentative. Jonathan looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he smiled. "Of course." Henry beamed, waving her over eagerly. "We're making a new flower bed, Eleanor. Jonathan says it'll bloom in spring." Eleanor knelt beside them, pressing her hands into the earth alongside theirs. For the first time in a long time, she felt grounded, connected to something bigger than her fears. That evening, Eleanor played her violin in the library, the music carrying through the halls of the mansion. Henry danced to the sound, his laughter ringing out like bells. Jonathan watched quietly, a faint smile on his face as he leaned against the doorway. The house, once a tomb of silence and emptiness, now overflowed with life. And for Eleanor, each note she played felt like a resurrection, a piece of herself she'd thought lost, now returned. For the first time, the mansion felt like home. The Blake mansion stood bathed in the golden light of morning, its tall windows reflecting a world that seemed, for once, to be at peace. Inside, the house felt alive, every corner, every shadow filled with a warmth that hadn't been there before. Eleanor sat by the piano in the library, her fingers drifting lazily across the keys, coaxing a soft, wistful melody from the instrument. Henry sat on the floor beside her, carefully drawing a picture of their castle, his name for the mansion. "It's not just a house, Eleanor," he said brightly, holding up his masterpiece. "It's our home." The words still felt foreign on her tongue, yet Henry said it so easily that Eleanor couldn't help but smile. She'd spent years carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, believing safety was something fleeting and fragile. But here, surrounded by music, light, and laughter, she began to believe in something she had long abandoned: permanence. Jonathan entered the room quietly, holding a cup of tea. "What's he drawing this time?" he asked with amusement, glancing at Henry's picture. "Our home," Eleanor replied softly, her voice steady, her smile faint but real. Jonathan studied her for a moment, taking in the change. The guarded, wary woman he'd met that stormy night was still there, but her edges had softened. "You're different, you know," he said, setting the tea on the piano. Eleanor glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Different how?" Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. "Lighter. Like you finally put down a burden you didn't need to carry." Eleanor looked away, her fingers trailing over the piano keys again. "Maybe I have," she admitted quietly. And for the first time, she didn't feel the need to argue. Outside, Henry was already dragging Jonathan to the garden to check on the flowers they'd planted weeks earlier. Eleanor watched them from the window, Jonathan kneeling to inspect the plants while Henry proudly pointed out every sprouting leaf. The sight made her heart ache, but not from pain. It was a new kind of ache, one she wasn't used to: gratitude. They're happy, she thought, and the realization settled into her bones. For so long, she had been the only one holding their world together. Now, she wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, the mansion transformed completely. Henry's laughter echoed through the halls, blending with the sound of Eleanor's violin. Jonathan, who had once lived in the shadows of his wealth, began to seem at ease in his own home. He spent more time in the garden or the library, often joined by Henry, who'd taken to calling him the best gardener in the world. "I didn't know I had competition," Eleanor teased one afternoon as she watched Jonathan help Henry tie a rope swing to a low-hanging branch. Jonathan looked up, grinning. "You'll have to work hard to beat me." The library became Eleanor's sanctuary. Jonathan had arranged for repairs to the old piano, and when she wasn't playing the violin, she would lose herself in its keys. It was as though music had finally come back to life inside her. Sometimes Jonathan would listen quietly, and other times Henry would join her, clumsily tapping at the higher notes and declaring himself a professional. Their days were full of small, simple joys, shared meals in the kitchen, long walks through the garden, and moments spent sitting together in silence, content just to be. One evening, Jonathan found Eleanor sitting outside on the steps, watching the sunset as Henry played nearby. "You seem far away," he said, sitting beside her. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I'm not," she replied. "I'm right here." Jonathan glanced at her, sensing something deeper in her words. "You've come a long way, Eleanor," he said. "You should be proud." Eleanor looked at him, her expression soft. "I didn't do it alone." Jonathan held her gaze, the air between them charged with something unspoken. "That's what family is for," he said finally, his voice low and sincere. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat at the word. Family. For so long, it had been just her and Henry, the only constant in a world that had taken so much from them. But now, as she looked at Jonathan and at Henry swinging from the tree, she realized they weren't alone anymore. The mansion wasn't just a place to survive. It had become a home, built on trust, respect, and something deeper that none of them dared name just yet. "Thank you, Jonathan," she said softly, breaking the silence. Turned to her, surprised. "For what?" "For not giving up on us," she replied. That night, the three of them sat together in the library, the fire crackling softly as Henry dozed off beside them. Eleanor picked up her violin and began to play, the melody soft and sweet, full of light. Jonathan listened quietly, his gaze steady, as though trying to commit the moment to memory. When she finished, he spoke softly. "You've brought this house back to life, Eleanor. And you've brought me back to life too." Eleanor looked at him, her heart full. "We did it together," she replied. As she carried Henry to bed later that night, Eleanor paused in the hallway, looking around the mansion. It no longer felt like a place they were intruding upon. The shadows were gone, replaced by warmth and light, laughter and love. Eleanor let out a soft breath, feeling peace settle deep in her chest. For years, she had fought to keep moving forward, to survive one day at a time. But now, standing here, she knew they had finally found it, a home. In the days that followed, life at the mansion unfolded like a story Eleanor never thought she'd get to live. Jonathan, Henry, and Eleanor grew into something more than three people sharing a roof. They became a family, imperfect, perhaps, but whole in all the ways that mattered. Music filled the house, flowers bloomed in the garden, and laughter became the new rhythm of their days. For the first time, Eleanor no longer feared the future. She embraced it, knowing they would face it together.